What is up, everybody? We are back after a 2-week hiatus from the show. Had Thanksgiving with family, and that was lovely. Then also had a good friend of mine and common contributor on the show, Liam, made the trip from Wyoming out here to beautiful Iowa, and we spent the weekend together last weekend. So didn't do this show, but I've been thinking about tonight's topic for actually pretty much since I did the last show. So we had the last show I laid out my sweet spot model of relationships, and there was a particular part of that conversation that I wanted to expand on, and it had to do with this issue of identity labels. And in thinking about it more, I realized it was a topic that warranted its own show, its own discussion, because I think it's a fairly loaded topic by itself. And then something happened. This weekend got real interesting real quick. And it only fed into why I think this topic is so important even more. So I've talked about it briefly on the show before, but I've had a lot of issues with my parents back and forth in life, and not respecting my intellectual curiosities, my intellectual growth, just kind of generally denying who I am. I had a fairly cult-like childhood that involved a whole lot of lifestyle restrictions that were preventing me from being who I was. And that's been an ongoing problem that's never been resolved, even well into adulthood. And it is the catalyst for the kind of out-of-the-box thinker that I am. Because it required me to think outside the box and think for myself to get out of it, honestly. And that's a big deal. So, particularly this weekend, I guess I might as well tell the story here live, but ultimately what happened is my father apparently took offense to the fact that I had not sent him a happy birthday wish. Now, understand something, that he has 3 grandchildren that he never bothers to call on their birthday, say happy birthday to. Oftentimes my birthdays are kind of bittersweet because it's usually anything nice they may do. There's always some kind of double meaning or extra expectation layered into it, like, hey dude, like, here's this thing we got for you since we know you've been struggling to pay for it yourself. You know, it's never just, here, we love you, just take this, you know, we just wanted to give you something out of the goodwill of our hearts. There's always something behind it. And this has been growing for a long time. And that's totally separate from our ideological differences. That's just has to do with relationships and how one shows love. And from people who claim to be Christian and full of love, there's a big miss here. And there's a big miss that frequently comes, it's very one-sided from their direction often, which is part of why it's the catalyst for tonight's show, and I'll get into that. However, what this text said specifically was, your father said he didn't get a call or text from his son. You see, the implication in the label son there is that I have a certain obligation because I'm a son. Because I'm a son, I have a certain obligation or duty to meet a standard of etiquette based on that. when that word gets used in that context of that sentence, that's what my mom meant. Now, without getting into too much of the details of what followed, because it is kind of a personal family matter and a back and forth, and I'm genuinely not trying to drag them through the mud, but my response was fairly simple. I was pretty upset because 7 months ago, 8 months ago, I don't remember. It was a long while ago now. I wrote them a letter. A 7-page letter. And in that letter, I went into full detail about where I thought we could come to some terms and agree on some things, and where I thought the sources of that could come from, even though we're so different ideologically, and why they have been hurting me by failing to appreciate that the beliefs I now hold aren't because I've rejected God out of some rebellion or desire to be some kind of sinful, horrible person, that these have been intellectual pursuits, and that it's a legitimate place to stand from somebody who's thinking philosophically and intellectually. And I tried to make that case in a way that was fair and respectful to their belief system, even though I'm sure you've heard me be relatively crass about religion normally. I mean, I went out of my way in the letter to make special exception. Now, why am I bringing up the letter from 7 months ago? I've never gotten a reply to that letter. I got excuses for the first couple weeks when it first came out that it was tax time, they had a lot of stuff going on, it was a chunky letter, tough to get through. I'll let that go for a month. I would let that go even for 2 months. Now we're talking about 7-8 months. At least. Actually, I feel like it's got to be longer than that, actually. But I don't know. Time's been weird. COVID makes time pass weird. So where are we? We're in a place where I have almost no relationship with them since we've moved out. And I don't care to, right? And so then, because they take no interest in what matters to me, I do often forget these little things of so-called son obligations. And ultimately, what means something more? Me sending a meaningless happy birthday text? Or when your son, in an attempt to reconcile differences, makes a genuine effort to put his best thinking on paper, actually replying to him? Like, which would mean more? Which actually has more substance to it? And the difference between that was so stark, it just bothered me. And so I told my mother, I'm sorry, if I lack a little sympathy here, but I'm still waiting on a response to my letter. This ended up turning into a back and forth because my mom then refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, admit any mistakes, and then spent the next few text messages completely gaslighting me and basically saying that I should just accept that the things with my parents are the way they are, especially my father, because that's just who he is, and he only shows love through money, and he's not a very emotional or affectionate person, and so I should just get over it. No. I have more self-respect than that. I have more... I care about myself more than that. I don't accept unfair treatment from anyone for any reason. So the choice was made via a back and forth to cut all ties and go no contact with my parents from here on out. And a lot of people might find that to be an extreme thing to do. A lot of people might find that to be a extreme measure. Now, if you knew the situation with my parents, I could probably bring up some things that would change your mind. But I think we can all think of a situation where it does make sense to have no contact with a parent, where parent is an identity label that doesn't really mean anything, right? I mean, what about a parent who was the biological birth giver, but then gives that child away at birth for adoption and then never has any contact with that child in the future? Is there any real thing that parent is tied to that would make sense to have a sense of duty or obligation to that child? I think sometimes we get confused and we think that this matters and is important. And I want to demonstrate tonight why I think it's just not. So, the first one I want to talk about is kind of like my first big identity label that I would put out there growing up that I felt like carried a lot of weight and meant a lot. And that one was that I was a Christian. Now, for me, identifying myself as a Christian, number one, that label was given to me because the religion was given to me. I didn't choose it. My mom married my stepdad. I've never really had a real relationship with my biological father. I was 6 when they got married. We started going to church once, twice a week. Really from that point forward. So being a Christian was part of my life. I was going to Christian schools. I took Bible class regularly. I mean, every part of my life growing up had something to do with being a Christian. Now, the first problem with the label is that it comes from somewhere else. How good is an identity label that you do not self-identify as? I mean, I think that question kind of answers itself. It's no good at all. The other problem with that particular label, when I started owning it, is that it means really different things to really different people. I mean, being a Christian can range the gambit from simply, I believe in God, to what it means to be a real Christian is to sacrifice all of your earthly possessions to Jesus, follow him everywhere, plunge your life into ministry, abandon earthly desires and worldly things, just dive so fully into it that every single part of your beliefs, identity, day-to-day life are embodied in that word, Christian. Well, if we have that on the one extreme, and I believe in God, but it doesn't go much further than that. I don't go to church. I don't even read the Bible. I have no idea what's in the Bible. I just believe in Yahweh. On the other end of the spectrum, what does it mean to be a Christian? If you tell somebody else I'm Christian, a lot of times people just walk away from that and go, oh, I think I learned something when they said that. They didn't learn anything because, again, where do you fall on that massive spectrum from one point to the other? They have no idea. Often I would tell people after I became an adult and I had to explain what's up with my parents, as I would say, well, they're Christians. And people would be like, so what? No. Like, they're Christians on that extreme end of their whole life is plunged into ministry. Everything is all consuming about God. Like, they take it over the top. They believe in works of the Spirit, this, that, the other thing. So even using the label doesn't really get me anywhere because I then have to explain everything else already. So the label wasn't very useful in that sense. The third thing about that label for me growing up was it gave me a false sense of superiority. I'm a Christian. That means I live my life above you, worldly losers. And Christians know that they do this. In fact, they're proud of it. They wear it on their sleeve. They love to tell you that they're so much better than you, so much happier than you, so much, just everything about them is better because they're a Christian. And for that matter, this goes for a lot of the Judeo-Christian world. Muslims often do this. Jews often do this. They use that label to put themselves in a position of moral superiority, thinking superiority to you, It's a way to say that they're above other people. And what's creepy about that, right? I think that should automatically kind of tip you off to the fact that, that is kind of messed up. There's kind of an at-bottom problem there, because that doesn't necessarily mean anything. Now, do I think it's possible for people to be morally superior to others? Absolutely. Do I think there's such a thing as moral expertise or, better ways to live our lives? Absolutely. Do I think there's moral genius, even? Yes. Do I think from time to time some of those people have been Christians? You bet. Does any of that have anything to do with being Christian? No. And that's the disconnect. The label doesn't do anything for you. It's not indicative of anything, because it's what about the beliefs underneath of it is what matters. I hate to break it to you, but to be a Christian means to pledge yourself to a cult of human sacrifice. It may be only one, but it does celebrate a single sacrifice of a human being that makes the whole world better, right? John 3:16. So, right off the bat, I can think of a better way to gain moral freedom and moral guidance and a better moral life. I don't think anyone should have to die for other people. Ever. That's just not needed. And what's worse is it's really weird because it's scapegoating. It's like, look, whatever you did that was wrong, Jeffrey Dahmer, all you gotta do is come to me, man, because I died for you. So, like, it's all good, bro. Like, no. There's no moral accountability with that system. So, already by identifying as a Christian, I can give you the fundamental thing of what it is to be a Christian already lacks some moral wealth to it from the jump. So your sense of moral superiority can just be argued against immediately. And I do argue against it immediately, and I don't take it very seriously. And I have to stress, this is very different than saying I'm a spiritual person, my connection to the God I believe in brings my life meaning and joy, and you accept that you're not morally superior because of that belief. I've got no problem with those people. But be honest with yourselves. How many Christians fall into that category? It's not many. I would say the number's growing. There's more of them now than there probably ever have been in the past. But there's still so much of that moral superiority teaching when people own the moniker Christian and what it means to be a Christian. So for myself, all of that was true. I can remember talking to kids at my school and telling them they weren't Christian enough because of the types of music they were allowing themselves to listen to and the type of sin that I was judging them for. These are things I deeply and wholly regret now. They were really, really messed up. Granted, I was the product of brainwashing and upbringing. I don't say that to hide behind it, but this is how it works. This is what leads somebody like myself to commit real crimes against their fellow human. Certainly that sense of moral superiority when it came to Christian, especially growing up in the, late 90s, early 2000s, was purity culture, right? Oh, yes, us Christians are so much better than you filthy sex fiends out there. And I would go to purity conferences and hype ourselves up about that, and I was a total hypocrite. I was just as obsessed with sex as any other 14-year-old or 15-year-old. And because it turns out that's a biological process and it's normal. And if I had actually been educated about it and encouraged to deal with things in healthy ways, I would have been a lot better off. So it was actually morally inferior to be operating the way that I was. And that can be argued for fairly straightforwardly and has been argued for in philosophical circles. So I just want to plant a flag there with my personal example and the word Christian of some of the key problems that I see. But I want to go deeper than that. Now, you may be thinking at this point, okay, so Christian as a label comes with all those problems. But that's a really specific kind of label, right? It specifically relates to a belief structure in the Christian God, whatever. You know, general labels, like social labels, are fine. They don't have this kind of weight to them. Well, I'm going to dig into that a little further. Let's talk about a label like boyfriend. What does boyfriend mean? Well, not that long ago, boyfriend used to mean a girl who had a man on the side from her private relationship that was her boyfriend, or girlfriend meant the same thing, right? For men who had, which was the more common, had a side project, right? Side chick, as the kids say. I hate that word. Anyway, you know, that it used to mean an affair of some kind. It used to mean somebody you were in an ongoing, repeated affair with outside of your marriage. How do we use it today? What does it mean today? It's really interesting. I've watched it kind of change over the last few years. Like, people hesitate now more than ever to put labels on things a lot of times. They're like, we don't want to label it. But then inevitably somebody in the relationship will say, well, what are we? And the moment that word boyfriend gets uttered in that conversation, or girlfriend, boyfriend and girlfriend, right? What happens? Immediately, both people accept a picture of reality based on what that word means to them if they decide to accept this, and they broadcast that out. Be honest with yourself. Who thinks that those two pictures are going to match? Anybody? I'm going to say probably not. At least in some ways, your idea of what it means to be a boyfriend-girlfriend and my idea of what it means to be boyfriend-girlfriend are going to divulge. They're going to diverge. There's no way that they're going to be 100% equal, because we all have different ideas and expectations about what that label means. That level of exclusivity for some people means your boyfriend-girlfriend. That means you stop having any kind of private one-on-one conversations with members of the opposite sex who you might be attracted to, now that we've adopted this label. You know, before we were single, you know, I let that stuff slide, even though we had started to kind of build an ongoing relationship. But now that we're official, because we've put this word around it, this magical word that we think has magical properties that you and I can't even agree on or understand what it means, because they're not equal, and we have different pictures of it. Like, I hope it's obvious how that breaks down almost immediately. And then the next problem with this particular social kind of label is the intended use versus the intended purpose. And I think it's the wide gulf between those two factors that makes it particularly problematic or insidious. And so let me explain what I mean by that. Just to put the social ones, because it's a more loaded topic, let's go back to Christian for a moment. I use Christian to describe myself, and someone else's experience of what it means to be a Christian is immediately realized in their brain. Now, their experience of what a Christian was compared to the kind of Christian that I was growing up is guaranteed to be categorically different. I mean, almost entirely different. There's no way that those two pictures will match, as we just described with boyfriend and girlfriend. So, what's going to happen then? Well, now I've put ideas into their head. I'm going to have to do extra work deconstructing those preconceived ideas. No. What I mean by Christian is I live like a really exclusive life where I hold myself to a higher standard. I don't watch rated R movies. I don't curse. The purity thing, all of this stuff. And people are like, I mean, that's kind of intense, man. Like, that's a lot of Christian. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I'm a pretty intense Christian, right? Like, it's now I have to do the difficult work of deconstructing their preconceived ideas from the moment I said Christian. That's extra work. It's extra work that I don't need to do. You'd just be better off without the label. Because at bottom, Christian simply means you believe in the Christ. That's it. The rest of that stuff doesn't necessarily follow from Christian. What was I doing? I was putting that idea in their head because I wanted the label. I wanted to shift how they saw the label and make myself the model Christian because I believed there was a meaning there that wasn't really there, and it made it special. It gave me special place in the social world. That's what I believed. And in reality, the problem is whatever their picture is in their head, even if I do a decent job trying to explain what's different between their idea of Christian and what I put forward, even if I did a decent job, they're still going to have some preconceived ideas based on what Christian meant to them that I either missed or we never got to. And so now I've painted a false and incomplete picture of my identity to them, which was the exact opposite of the purpose of the label. And this is what I mean by intended purpose versus the use, right? The purpose of the social labels, all social labels, are to help describe our place, make it simple, give a set of characteristics that people can understand, that are easy. But now I've painted a false one that takes extra work to undo. This is why I don't like them. It's way easier to just talk about your individual beliefs one by one and not label yourself in a way that creates more work for yourself. It's much easier to avoid printing a false picture of yourself in someone else's mind than it is to give them that false picture and then try to fix it. I hope that makes some sense. And so now, let's take that back to boyfriend, girlfriend. Hey. What's up, Kelsey? Let's take it back to boyfriend, girlfriend. So, we agree that we're boyfriend, girlfriend, right? Again, we've painted a false picture in each other's minds of what boyfriend and girlfriend is supposed to mean. Where's the problem with that? Now we're going to have to do the extra work of deconstructing it. But now, boyfriend, girlfriend, more than the Christian thing, and this is why there's an extra layer here that I wanted to add in with this next piece and realize how the intended purpose versus the use becomes even more problematic. Because with boyfriend, girlfriend, we don't just have identity label, we have identity label with expectations. Not to say that there aren't expectations of somebody who calls themselves a Christian, there are, but those expectations are not as consequential as boyfriend, girlfriend. I'm going to have a list of things that I expect you to do because you're my girlfriend. Should I? Is that justified? Is that reasonable? I think no, right? And I think no because I have to justify any expectation I put on another person, or I'm not being fair to them. However, this is the society we live in, so people do this all the time, and they do have a set of expectations that come with that. By putting the label first, by saying let's go exclusive and let's call each other this, before actually talking about what set of expectations, what boundaries, what reasonably comes from that, means we're not going to talk about the expectations and the boundaries because we're going to assume that you know what they are. But what happens when the pictures don't match? What happens when the pictures are really different? Relationship instability, problems, immediate issues, and destruction. So the thing that we used because we thought it gave us a sense of security, that's a lot of times why people want to go exclusive and call themselves boyfriend, girlfriend, right? It's like, I just want, it means something to me. It feels good. Now, I'm going to test your ability here to stay with me on this topic even harder. Does that also apply to husband and wife, Alex? Absolutely. Absolutely. It applies to all identity labels regarding relationships because husband and wife comes with a set of expectations based on socially constructed ideas of what it means to be a husband or what it means to be a wife that you two did not create together and probably have not discussed. We think it gives us meaning, we think it gives us security, and yet it's guaranteed to be a different picture of what that word means in my mind and your mind. Now, in the case of husband and wife, a lot of people think that that's a really secure picture of what that looks like. But is it really? I mean, husband and wife in Hollywood is very, very different than husband and wife on Main Street. They have entirely different lives. Half the time, sometimes for the majority of the year, those people don't even live in the same house. So what does husband mean? What does wife mean? What are the set of expectations and understandings that go with it? We think there's a there. We think there's something more and special and magical about these labels that give it meaning. But when you challenge somebody on this, they have a really hard time telling you or explaining what that is. And that's been my experience. I've challenged people on this. And honestly, my experience is usually that they're starting to listen to me and then they start to get really uncomfortable. And I understand that uncomfort. And that's why I want to address it now. You are actually going to make your relationship more meaningful with your spouse, with the person you call your boyfriend, girlfriend, with your mother, father, sister, brother, whatever, your friend, whatever social labels that are out there. Micah, that's a great question. Isn't your daughter more important than your second cousin? And my answer to that is maybe. We'll come back to that. What I mean by you're going to make these relationships more meaningful by stopping thinking of them in terms of the label, okay, is because you're going to actually remove a restriction that limits the capacity of what that relationship is. Is our relationship just a husband and a wife? No, it's so much more than that. It's a beautiful, unique thing that contains all of our memories and our conjoined lives that we've spent together and times that we weren't husband and wife before we were husband and wife. And that's all part of it too. And it relates to our individual differences and ideas and opinions. And then there are times where we don't act like husband and wife in certain circles or social situations or whatever it happens to be for reasons. And that's all part of it too. The wholeness of your relationship gets put in a box when you put the label on it, and when you use it, your intended purpose should be to list a set of characteristics and things of understanding that make it easy for someone to digest. But it's really easy to use that to somebody else to quickly give them an idea of who that person is. And that's okay. It's totally acceptable. None of this is wrong, right? But if I say, oh, that's my wife, no matter what, again, I've painted a picture in their mind of everything that a wife is supposed to be. And if their picture of what a wife is supposed to be doesn't match up with what Micah's definition of a wife is supposed to be, I've actually done Micah a disservice in that situation. For example, if somebody thinks wife means that old school idea of a wife, that person who's at home, cooking and cleaning, taking care of the house needs, while husband is off working and providing. Anybody who knows my wife, she just laughed probably loud enough in the background for the microphone to pick it up, would realize why that would piss her off. So the label is bunk. Because wife to them does not mean wife. Wife doesn't mean anything. It's bad. It's just a fundamentally bad word that never really gets at truth. Now, you might say there's merit to Micah's question here. Isn't your daughter more important than your second cousin? And my answer was it depends. Here's why it depends. It depends on what you mean by daughter and what you mean by second cousin. Because again, those labels seem obvious, right? But what if you're a father who gave your daughter away at birth or never participated in your daughter's life? However, you've always maintained a great relationship with your second cousin. And maybe your reason for not being a part of your daughter's life was perfectly legitimate. I'm not talking about an abandonment, right? I'm talking about young teen parents that decide that what's best for their child is to give it up for adoption. So we use the word daughter, and we assume that means the kind of constant relationship that father-daughters should have. Except here's a simple condition that makes all of that not make sense anymore, right? The father gave that kid up for adoption and now went on with their life. So why should their daughter be more important than their second cousin? You see, when we use the label, yes, you can. When we use the label, we add a set of expectations. We add a set of ideas about what we think that word means, and then we hold others to that standard, and sometimes us doing that is very, very, very unjustified. And that's what I'm going to talk about next, is identity labels and the justification of expectations. But first, Micah's question. Whoops. Oh, I'm throwing everything.
Jinkies.
Come say it loud. You're off camera.
So, why does a definition... I think you actually just said you were going to answer this question. But, why does the definition change depending on who you're talking about? A daughter, just because a set of parents decide to give a child up for adoption, does not mean that they are not still a mother and a father, definitionally, to that daughter.
Okay. Sure.
Right?
Yeah, I agree with you. It doesn't mean that they did not contribute to the DNA of that child.
Yes, making them that.
Okay, but what are the expectations for?
But isn't that why you have other describing words such as adoptive parents?
Right. Okay, but you're missing my point. Is when we use that label towards others and we hold them to that label, we're doing so based on our preconceived ideas of what that word means, and we're putting those expectations onto them. That's completely unfair. Because what if you said, you're a father, you're a daughter, so here's what's now expected of you. Here's what's now expected of you. Well, why? What's the justification for that expectation? What is the purpose behind it? And is it justified? So, for somebody who gave their child up at birth, those expectations reasonably end. And we can all understand why they end. A person raised their hand and said, I can't do it. I know it's a bad circumstance for my life. I can't take responsibility for this. I'm not going to be capable of it. And we're fine with that. But if somebody does it at any other point in life or any other situation, right? We're like, you don't get to do that. You're a father. How dare you? You have a set of expectations and a set of rules based on being a father. Okay, that seems fair. That seems reasonable. If I started regularly, every time my kids were over here, being so high out of my mind that I couldn't function, couldn't do anything, you might have that conversation with me. And you might hold me to that label with all the moral weight behind it. How could you do that as a father? Is the problem because fathers are expected to be sober and good parents? Is that really the problem that we're talking about? No. The problem is that I have a relationship with my daughters, with Auden, with Emmy, with Adelie, and my actions are going to damage that relationship. That's it. That's the reason it's wrong. The reason it's wrong is because that relationship is important and beneficial and helps them in their lives. And my damaging that relationship by not participating in it like I should, you'd have to watch my sweet spot model to understand kind of where some of these ideas are coming from. But by failing to do so, I cause them harm. And causing them harm is bad regardless of any of the identity labels that you could put around it. The identity labels aren't useful at that point because they don't tell us anything. There's no realness there. The thing is they're a conscious creature that has an established connection to this conscious creature. And that established connection is wholly beneficial, partially dependent on each other for important things. And by failing to hold up my end of that, I reduce that level of connection, causing harm, and that's the bad. That's what's wrong. You don't need the word daughter. It would be wrong for me to do it in that way to anyone, regardless of their identity label. If I have a relationship that's already been established with somebody that on that level, and I do that, and I cause them that harm, it's wrong no matter what their title is, no matter what their label is, no matter who they are to me. That's the harm. And I think that's what people really confuse. To take it back to my parents. They fundamentally have never been very connected to me. It would have helped. It would have been nice. It's hurt. It's hurt a lot. Because here's these people who spend all your time with, shaping you, contributing to who you're going to become, give you some of their genes, give you some of their, insights to life and education and do all of those things. And then you get into adulthood, and when you realize that most of that was based on conditions, and then you're no longer meeting those conditions and the rug gets ripped out from underneath of you, they feel a sense of superiority because you didn't listen to them. You didn't follow them and you disobeyed. And so you've lost your rights as a son. I mean, that's really ultimately how they looked at it. When I abandoned God and pursued Alex. They don't feel as though I'm worthy of the benefits of being their son, because I was somehow disrespecting their right as a mother and father to have a level of control over me. And that's where the labels become really fucking toxic. Like, wicked fucking toxic. And yeah. The problem is when you do that, when you use that label to the person that carries it. As your father, this is what I expect. As your mother, this is what I expect. As your husband, this is what I expect. As your boss, this is what I expect. As your cousin, this is what I expect. You see how all of a sudden the further out, the less it makes sense? What about banker? Do we have a problem with that label? I don't because bankers don't typically expect anything from me socially other than not to, get violent in their office. There's a difference between labels that describe a function and labels that ascribe meaning. And so this was the essential identity labels. And I'm trying to draw this distinction really, really clearly because there's a difference between banker, painter, politician, and black husband, father. Now, is there really a difference? Well, functionally, there is a function behind black husband, father. Black relates to, a variety of skin tones, and the moment you start saying also applies to culture, once again, you immediately are now detached from the actual function, the skin color, and you've brought on so much identity expectations that whatever picture you paint in somebody else's mind that black is, it becomes completely different in their minds versus your mind. Because you have your picture of what it means to be black, and they have their picture of what it means to be black, and they divulge. And obviously we know what that leads to at its worst. It's the worst kind of racism. But we don't see all these other social identity labels as having the same potential level of toxicity, and maybe we should. My aunt straight up told me I'm not allowed to have anything of my dad's who passed last year because I haven't behaved as her niece properly. I've not earned that right in her mind. I'm expected to perform a role and play her game in order to earn the right to have something of her brother's. Conditional love based on her perception of what the label niece means. And that's another perfect example of exactly what I am talking about. And it's toxic. And for me, it was so toxic that I severed ties with my parents finally this weekend. And then I drank a lot last night to celebrate because it honestly felt like a 30-year weight had been lifted off of my shoulders. And all identity labels carry this same problem. Fundamentally, they all have this same problem. Whether it's black, husband, father, right? Husband. There's a certain set of expectations that come with what it means to be a husband for most people. But some people have very different relationships. The only people it should matter to are the two people involved. But as a society, we set a set of moral expectations for those people based on those labels and then hold them to it. And it's completely unfair and it's completely unjustified. And we're wrong to do it. And we should stop doing it. We should stop doing it. But there's another layer here. And this is the one that's probably the hardest one for people to get on board with me on. And it's something that I encourage you to don't just take my word for it, but research, read about it, understand it more. And the last level is, what does it actually mean, identity? Is it essential? Does it so maybe your position is this so far. Okay, everything Alex has said has made sense. I agree. When we use that label, other people get a wrong picture, so we shouldn't paint wrong pictures in people's minds. That all makes sense. We shouldn't have expectations of people based on their labels, because the label could mean something different to them than it means to me, and that all makes sense. But I still think that black is part of my identity, or I still think that husband is part of my identity, or I still think that father is part of my identity, or wife, or whatever it is, right? Dog owner. That is a whole personality type. And it's essential to me. It's core. It really means something. No, it doesn't. That's my controversial take. You might think it really does. I'm not trying to offend you. Somebody's probably going to cancel me over just saying that right now. Where I notice this happen the most, because it's a community I spend a lot of time with and love very much, is the LGBTQ community, right? They think that there's something about the identity label of gay that's like really important to them and the whole culture that comes with it, right? But man, you can meet a gay person that is so far on the opposite end of a spectrum of another gay person that the moment you say that word, no matter who you're talking to, no matter who it is, you are guaranteed to be giving someone the wrong picture. Now, gay has a function. Usually that's a reference to homosexuality of some kind or whatever. And it's like, if you're talking about it as a strict substitute for nothing other than the function of the word, then it's fine like that. It doesn't carry any of those problems because there's no expectations for a person who self-describes as homosexual. It simply states a sexual preference. It means nothing. The moment you add the cultural expectations and all that other stuff on top of it, the moment you bring that in, that is where society now has a set of expectations for that person. Society now has a set of understanding and a picture that they have in their mind, and it's totally detached from what could really be the case. And why is that? Again, just to come back to it, maybe you're that gay person who's watching my show right now and you say, but gay means something to me. It's how I see myself. It's part of who I am. And it's really important to me. And it's important that other people see that for me. I understand you. And I've been there. But I've also been on the other side, and I'm going to talk about what that journey is. The thing that's funny about essential identity labels is they all have to do with your lived experience, your first-person experience. Now, there are two ways that I know of getting what's called ego death. And ego death is a first-person experience that you can either have in deep states of meditation or on a particular set of psychedelic drugs taken in a high enough dosage to have a significant trip. What it is means you are no longer self-identified with your thoughts. We spend most of our days being completely identified with our next thought that appears in consciousness. That thought appears in consciousness as though we produced it, but we don't really produce it. Just go ahead and try. Think to yourself, I want to think my next thought, and it's going to be this. And let me know how good you are at it. No matter what, you will relentlessly be interrupted by new thoughts that appear in consciousness or the sound of my voice. or the sound of a car outside. And no matter how much you try to not experience that, you have no choice. Those sounds, those thoughts appear in consciousness. You didn't control them. You didn't prevent them. And this first person experience is how we can experience the death of free will, but it's also how we can experience the death of the self. And realize that both the self and the free will we think we have are illusions. They're not real. There's no you there steering the boat on consciousness. There is just consciousness and its contents, and you can experience it without being identified as a self in your mind with all of your thoughts. And so why does that matter? If those are an illusion and there is no self, whatever you think these essential identity labels are for yourself, maybe they matter, but they're not real. Maybe they're useful, but they're not real. Because I'm not even Alex. Alex is a label and a word that I use so that other people can take a set of characteristics and apply it to the body that they see as I appear in their consciousness. But for me and myself, there is just consciousness and its contents. And Alex is fundamentally meaningless. Because think about it. Is Alex the same 20 years ago as he is today? I mean, obviously from this conversation tonight, you know that it's certainly not the case. Was Alex the same at 14 years ago? At 14 years old as he is today? No, and in fact, those two Alexes are probably really different Alexes. Right? Like, those two couldn't be any more different. Alex means something completely different right now to me than Alex meant to 14-year-old consciousness Alex. And so it's this distance, it's this difference, it's this distinction, it's this separation that leads to essential identity labels being bunk. There's nothing there. They don't matter. They don't mean anything. And again, if their main purpose is to help somebody else understand us, to give them a quick identifier, well, every time you use one, because you are confusing other people and giving them stuff based on their preconceived notions about what those labels mean, and they're not personal to you, they're broad spectrum, and other people use them, they're not unique, then they fail at their main primary purpose. Which is why they're not very helpful, and why they hurt us more often than they help us. It's a reduction of our individualism and what makes us unique and our lived experience special and wonderful and meaningful when we adopt identity labels and we make them part of our lives in some kind of significant way. And here's the real harm. Here's where I think this gets the worst. For some people, they become so essential that when the conflict ends up appearing between the arbitrary and I don't know how to say not real. The unreal and arbitrary nature of the label will eventually be put into conflict with the very not arbitrary and very real problem of your place in this world. And when those two things become into a significant conflict, you experience crisis. I certainly did when I realized I no longer believed in God. What does it mean to not be a Christian anymore? I've built everything into that label. I've built everything into that identity. And now it's all for nothing. It means nothing. And I became depressed. I became really, really, really depressed because now those two things came into conflict. And they came into conflict so hard because the label was never real. It was arbitrary. What about when divorce happens? I've seen myself as wife for the last 10 years. I've seen myself as husband for the last 10 years. Now who am I? What does it mean now that I'm not husband or wife? Because those labels aren't real and they're arbitrary and we made them up, it reduced our level of individualism and what makes us who we are when we put ourselves in that box. So then we take it away and we realize that we don't know who we are and we have a problem because we made some stuff up about it and complicated the issue and confused ourselves. And that's the real harm. The real harm is having these identity labels that we make essential that are not based on reality, spreading those to other people, creating a set of expectations, and these conflicts will come up. Eventually something you will experience and what it'll be like to be you will be very different than what you believe about those labels that you've put on yourself. And when that happens, it will shake you to your core. And it will cause such a big conflict that it will cause mental distress and anguish and a lot of problems. I think this is true for all forms of identity label. I really do. And if you have heard all this and you're like, yeah, but I still think they're useful, and you want to have a debate about it or you disagree with me, I know this is probably one of my most hot takes, probably one of my most controversial opinions, but I think I'm really solidly justified here. I think we're doing ourselves more harm than good with these words. So, a couple ways you can come at me. You can DM me on any of my social media, whether it be Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Drop something in the comments if you feel like that's a good way to do it. If you want to actually have a direct conversation with me and a direct debate with me, the best thing to do is join my Discord, which you can find from my link tree. But before you do, and before you disagree with me, take my challenge first. Take your most important relationship in your life right now, and try to think about what that relationship would mean if you deconstructed the label around it, and just experience the uniqueness and the amazingness of your connection with that person as individuals, as whole, complete individuals without that label. And see if there's a there. And if you take my challenge and you can honestly tell me that you took my challenge, then I will be willing to debate with you from there. But if you don't at least give what I'm saying a fair shake, then I'm going to say that you're probably coming back at me in bad faith. But if you do take my challenge and you still have issue with what I said here tonight, the best thing to do is find me in my Discord. So my link tree is posted on my profile on any of my pages, Facebook, YouTube, whatever, and you can find it there. Other than that, that's all I have for tonight. We're not going to do the onion tonight. We're just going to call the stream. I have some stuff going on. Obviously, it was a pretty heavy weekend, and I've been very busy with my new job. So I'm gonna call it for there. But we'll bring up the stream beats and take her out. I appreciate and love y'all. Thanks for joining me tonight. I hope you learned something or enjoyed something. And if nothing else, you found something that we can have a debate about. Y'all have a good night.